The smoke they laughed at, February 1944. Somewhere over Germany, the winter sky trembled with the echo of engines. On the edge of an airfield near Hanover, Luftwaffe pilots leaned against their Messerschmitts, watching black smoke spiral on the horizon. They laughed. Another Allied raid gone wrong, one said, certain that the smoke belonged to British bombers torn apart by flak. But as the wind shifted, the laughter stopped. The column of smoke wasn't retreating west, it was rising from their own hangars. Their own aircraft. Their own home base. Engines roared to life in panic. Ground crews scattered. The black trail above the clouds became the mark of something they had never imagined possible, the death of German air superiority. In that moment, pride turned to silence. The hunters had become the hunted. And from the sky above Germany, the war itself began to change forever. Military metal. This is WW2 Heroic Realism, where history breathes through fire, steel, and truth. Subscribe to witness the moments that changed the world. In 1940, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the skies above Warsaw, German aircraft ruled the air with unmatched precision and confidence. Their pilots, veterans of Spain and Poland, flew with the conviction of superiority. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was the symbol of dominance, its sharp nose and roaring engine carrying the pride of the Reich. Across Europe, their enemies feared the Black Cross on silver wings. Every British or French pilot knew the odds. Every bombing raid against German territory ended with crippling losses. And every German airfield echoed with the same confidence, that no one could reach them. It was a confidence born not of arrogance alone, but of evidence. By 1941, the Luftwaffe had proven itself the most experienced air force on the planet. It had mastered coordination, tactics, and air-ground synchronization. It had crushed nations before breakfast. And its commanders, men like Hermann Göring, believed the war would be won not by armies, but by the air. Yet even as the smoke cleared over the Battle of Britain, cracks began to show. Germany's vision of air supremacy was built on an assumption, that the enemy would never recover fast enough to strike back. They underestimated the factory belts of America. They underestimated the resilience of British radar. And they underestimated the silent evolution happening across the Atlantic. While the Luftwaffe celebrated, American engineers were building something extraordinary. In factories from Seattle to Detroit, thousands of hands were crafting the B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber designed to fly high, endure punishment, and strike with precision. Soon after, the B-24 Liberator followed, faster, longer range, deadlier payload. These weren't the slow, clumsy aircraft German pilots had mocked in 1942. These were machines born from industrial might, machines that could reach Germany itself. But early in the war, when a few scattered Allied bombers appeared over occupied France, the Luftwaffe laughed. To German eyes, the Allied bombing campaigns of 1941 and early 1942 were pathetic. A few squadrons, badly coordinated, often missing their targets by miles. When black smoke rose in the distance, it almost always came from a downed British or American plane. For German pilots, those plumes were trophies. They'd count them, mock them, even pose for photos beside their burning wrecks. It became a dark ritual, the smoke meant victory. What they didn't realize was that every one of those fallen bombers was part of something bigger. Each loss taught the Allies a lesson. Each mission gathered data. Each dead crewman made the next raid more precise, more disciplined, more deadly. By 1943, the laughter began to fade. The Allied air strategy evolved into something the Germans hadn't anticipated, a systematic dismantling of the Reich from above. Factories. Rail lines. Refineries. And soon, airfields. Every mission carried the same message: no sky was safe anymore. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, now found itself defending its own skies, burning fuel and pilots faster than it could replace them. And still, Göring refused to believe the air war could be lost. He promised Hitler that German defenses were impregnable, that no enemy would ever touch the heart of the Reich. But far to the west, across the English Channel, thousands of bombers were gathering in quiet airfields under the grey English dawn, engines warming, propellers cutting through fog. They were coming not just for the cities, but for the Luftwaffe itself. The black smoke the Germans once mocked was about to return, not as a symbol of victory, but as the signal of their own destruction. By early 1943, the balance of the air war was quietly shifting. The Luftwaffe still flew with confidence, but its edges had begun to fray. Pilot casualties were rising. Fuel shortages were spreading. Factories were now repairing as many planes as they were building. And above all, a new enemy had entered the skies. The U.S. 8th Air Force, operating from airfields across southern England, represented something the Germans had never faced before, a machine of war that didn't tire, didn't retreat, and didn't stop coming. Each day, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators took off in coordinated formations so vast they blotted out the sun. German radar screens glowed with endless blips, a sky filled with wings. At first, the Luftwaffe believed these new raids would end as before, with the bombers shot down, engines burning, and German soil untouched. And indeed, the first months were costly for the Americans. Raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg saw dozens of bombers destroyed, crews vanishing into clouds of flak and smoke. German pilots once again laughed, calling the raids suicide missions. The smoke that rose across Bavaria was still, for a while, someone else's. But behind those losses, a storm was building. The Americans adapted. They changed formation tactics. They restructured escort routes. And most importantly, they introduced the one weapon that would tilt the air war forever, the P-51 Mustang. With its long range and powerful Merlin engine, the Mustang could finally escort bombers deep into Germany, something no Allied fighter had done before. It could climb higher, turn tighter, and strike harder than anything the Luftwaffe had left. Now, the hunters became the hunted. German pilots began to notice a terrifying new pattern. Wherever the bombers went, the Mustangs followed. The sky above Germany became a trap, a deadly game of cat and mouse where the Germans no longer made the rules. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's fuel depots were under constant threat. Training schools were forced to relocate or shut down entirely. Young recruits barely completed 10 hours of flight time before being sent into combat, many never returning. Even elite squadrons were beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion. Then came Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week. In February 1944, Allied commanders launched a campaign to break the Luftwaffe once and for all. For 7 days, thousands of bombers targeted aircraft factories, supply lines, and most devastatingly, airfields themselves. The strategy was simple and merciless: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground before it could ever take off again. And for the first time, the black smoke over Germany wasn't from Allied bombers. It was from Luftwaffe bases, hangars burning, planes exploding on runways, pilots running for cover. Entire air groups were wiped out before they even reached the skies. At first, the Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. Reports came in from bases near Leipzig, Brunswick, and Hanover, all under direct attack. For the Luftwaffe, it was unthinkable. The same smoke they had mocked for years was now curling upward from their own airfields. One German pilot described the horror in his diary: "We watched our own airfield burn. The sky was black, not from enemy wrecks, but from our own machines. We could do nothing but watch." The laughter was gone. The arrogance had vanished. And with every rising column of smoke, the Luftwaffe's confidence turned to dread. By spring 1944, Allied bombers ruled the sky. What began as a war of machines had become a war of survival, a struggle between an empire that believed it could never fall and a coalition that refused to stop rising. And as the fires spread across Germany's airfields, one question remained: how long could the Luftwaffe endure before the smoke consumed everything? Angle 1, the human sky, fear, fatigue, and faith in the beginning, Luftwaffe pilots carried themselves with pride, the kind of pride born from years of dominance. They were the Jaeger, the hunters of Europe's skies, and for them, flight was an art. Every takeoff was a statement. Every dogfight was a performance. But by 1944, the romance had died. The cockpits had become coffins. Young replacements, some just 19, climbed into planes they barely knew how to operate. The veterans, the Experten, watched as their units filled with faces that had never seen real combat. Each morning, black smoke hung over the horizon, the same smoke they once celebrated. Now it marked the ruins of their own bases, their own aircraft, their own brothers. Ground crews worked through the night under dim red lamps, patching holes with trembling hands. Fuel trucks rolled cautiously between bomb craters, carrying the last barrels of aviation spirit. And in the barracks, the silence was heavier than the sound of engines. Pilots wrote letters before each flight, not for lovers, but for their parents. One mechanic recalled, "We stopped talking about tomorrow. We only spoke of who made it back today." Even among victory claims, there was no celebration anymore. A kill meant little when the man beside you never returned. The Luftwaffe's greatest weapon had always been morale. But morale, once broken, is a wound no steel can repair. And in the quiet between missions, when the night was still and the distant sky glowed orange, they realized, the hunters were running out of sky. Angle 2, the tactical shift, precision meets persistence on the Allied side, the air war had transformed into an intricate machine, precise, relentless, and methodical. Every mission was a test of endurance, coordination, and courage. Where German raids once struck by surprise, the Americans and British bombers now operated like a moving city, a city of steel, thunder, and discipline. Each aircraft had a role. Each gunner, navigator, and pilot worked in perfect rhythm. The introduction of long-range escorts changed everything. The P-51 Mustang could finally follow bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a feat that shattered the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. For years, German interceptors relied on fuel-limited sorties. They attacked quickly, from altitude, and dove back home before running dry. But now, Allied fighters lingered. They stayed over targets, circled above airfields, and hunted returning planes. The Germans called them Himmelhund, dogs of the sky. There was no escaping them. During Big Week, Allied air commanders targeted not only factories but the very heart of the Luftwaffe, its infrastructure. Rail lines carrying spare parts, depots storing ammunition, communication centers, even runways were systematically destroyed. When smoke rose from German soil, it no longer symbolized victory. It symbolized paralysis. Without repair facilities, damaged planes were left to rot. Without spare engines, even the best Messerschmitt stayed grounded. Every loss now cut deeper, not just in steel, but in time. And time was the one thing Germany no longer had. Angle 3, the technological divide, innovation versus exhaustion. The war in the air was not only a contest of courage, it was a war of machines. And in 1944, one side's machines had evolved beyond the other's reach. The Germans had pioneered many marvels, from the Focke-Wulf 190 to the revolutionary Me 262 jet fighter. But innovation without production was like a sword without a handle. Factories that once built the Luftwaffe's finest now stood in ruins. Skilled engineers were drafted into combat. Supply lines were strangled. Each new aircraft design arrived too late, in too few numbers, and with too little fuel to matter. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Allied factories were a thunderstorm of progress. Engines rolled out by the thousands. Replacement planes arrived faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The Americans perfected turbo-supercharged engines, giving their bombers high-altitude reach. British scientists refined radar jamming and targeting systems, blinding flak gunners below. Even weather forecasting became a weapon, enabling perfect timing for raids that the Germans could no longer predict. Technology, once the Luftwaffe's greatest ally, had turned against it. The empire of innovation was now running on fumes. And while the Germans still produced some of the most advanced machines of the war, like the Me 262 and Arado 234, they arrived into a sky already lost. A handful of jets could not turn back a storm of thousands. The black smoke rising from those airfields told the truth. Germany's age of air superiority had ended not with a crash, but with a slow suffocation. Angle 4, the leadership strain. Orders without airfields. By late 1944, Luftwaffe headquarters resembled a theater of denial. On the maps inside underground command rooms, colored pins still marked fighter wings that no longer existed. Generals issued flight orders to squadrons that had already been wiped out. Hermann Göring, once the flamboyant architect of the Luftwaffe, now faced a nightmare of his own creation. He refused to believe that Germany had lost control of the skies. Every report of failure was blamed on cowardice or lack of faith. Yet on the ground, the truth could not be hidden. Fuel shortages grounded entire divisions. Maintenance units lacked parts to keep engines running. And as Allied bombers pounded refineries like Luna and Politz, aviation fuel, the lifeblood of any air force, became rarer than gold. Pilots were ordered to fly one-way interceptions, knowing their aircraft might not have enough fuel to return. Commanders wept privately as they relayed those orders. Even experienced aces like Adolf Galland, once a national hero, clashed bitterly with Göring over the misuse of the few remaining fighters. Galland argued for concentrated defense, saving resources for critical targets. Göring, obsessed with retaliation, demanded attacks everywhere at once. The result was chaos in the skies. Squadrons were scattered, coordination collapsed, and brave men were wasted in futile missions. Leadership had become delusion, and delusion had become policy. The black smoke over the airfields was not just from Allied bombs. It was the smoke of a system burning itself from within. Angle 5, the moral collapse. When victory turned to survival in the early years, Luftwaffe pilots fought for pride, for glory, for the Reich. By 1944, they fought only to survive the day. There was no illusion of conquest anymore, only endurance. The lines between duty and despair blurred. Veterans who had once toasted victories now stared blankly at the horizon, waiting for the next siren. Young cadets trained for weeks instead of months and were rushed into combat, often dying on their very first mission. Their instructors told them, if you're lucky, you'll last 2 flights. Faith in leadership evaporated. Faith in purpose followed soon after. The once proud Luftwaffe code, Ehre, Mut, Opfer, honor, courage, sacrifice, still hung on walls, but it no longer resonated. Pilots fought not for ideology, but for the man flying beside them. And when that man didn't return, a little more of their will to fight died too. In one base outside Hanover, a priest was asked to perform funeral rites daily, until he himself was killed in a bombing raid. The chaplain who replaced him refused to hold services anymore. There are too many ghosts, he said. The black smoke became a symbol of something larger than loss. It was the last visible sign of a nation's fading soul. Angle 6, the enemy's awakening. Smoke as a turning point across the channel, Allied pilots began to notice something strange in the skies over Germany. Resistance, once fierce and organized, began to thin. Dogfights became rarer. German formations broke apart sooner. At first, they suspected deception, perhaps a trap, or a hidden reserve. But then came the realization, Germany was bleeding out. The same black smoke that once terrified Allied crews, the proof of their comrades shot down, now marked victory. It was rising from German soil. From their hangars. From their airfields. From the heart of the Reich. One American pilot described flying over a bombed-out airbase near Kassel. You could see wrecked Messerschmitts lined like graves. The smoke curled up slow, like the war itself was exhaling. It was a sobering sight, not triumphant, not joyous, but heavy. Even among the victors, there was no real celebration anymore. The air war had taken its toll on both sides, pilots staring into empty skies, ground crews tending to smoldering ruins. And yet, the Allies understood that this was the moment everything shifted. For years, Germany had been the predator. Now, it was the hunted. The black smoke no longer belonged to the Allies. It belonged to the Luftwaffe. And as it drifted higher each day, it carried with it the last remnants of Hitler's dream of air dominance, a dream that had finally turned to ash. The day the skies over Germany went silent, March 18, 1945. Dawn broke cold and colorless over the shattered heart of Germany. At Leipzig, Bremen, and Würzburg, air raid sirens began their long, mournful wail. But this time, there would be no counterattack. For years, German pilots had mocked the black smoke columns rising over London and Rotterdam, seeing them as signs of Allied weakness. Now, that same smoke was billowing from their own hangars, their own cities, their own homes. The Allied offensive known as Operation Clarion was underway, a massive, coordinated strike aimed at the destruction of Germany's transport and air support network. It was the largest low-level attack of the war. Over 9,000 Allied aircraft filled the skies, attacking rail lines, bridges, and, most decisively, airfields. By midday, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The fall of the Luftwaffe from above, American reconnaissance pilots described a sight that was both beautiful and horrifying. German airbases, once symbols of precision and discipline, were now fields of wreckage. Flames devoured Messerschmitt Bf-109s, FW-190s, and Me-262 jet prototypes before they could even leave the ground. At Paderborn, a squadron of Me-262s attempted a desperate scramble. Their takeoff run was interrupted by a swarm of P-47 Thunderbolts, diving almost vertically. Within seconds, the world's fastest jets were burning hulks. At Hanover-Varenwald, Luftwaffe ground crews watched helplessly as their radio masts were destroyed, communications severed. The irony was cruel. The very radios that had once broadcast Allied positions were now filled with static, crackling with the last words of doomed pilots. One American observer later wrote, "We didn't just bomb their planes. We bombed their ability to believe they could still fly." Across Germany, the same scene repeated itself, airfields turned to ash, hangars collapsed, runways cratered beyond use. Pilots who managed to take off found no place to land when they returned. The irony of the smoke by afternoon, from the skies above the Ruhr, Allied bombers could see it, a dark veil stretching across the horizon, not clouds, but smoke. German smoke. It was the ultimate reversal. For the first time since 1939, Germany was no longer feared from the air. It was pitted. Pilots who once roared into battle laughing over the radio now whispered final words before bailing out. Command posts fell silent. And when the wind shifted, the acrid scent of burning oil and rubber carried across the countryside, a grim message from one airfield to another, "It's over." Voices from the ground. One mechanic from Jägerschwader 27 recalled the moment his base was hit, the ground shook. "We couldn't hear ourselves shout. I looked up, the entire sky was red. Then came the smoke. So black, it blotted out the sun." Another Luftwaffe officer, interrogated after the war, said quietly, "When we saw that smoke, we knew the Reich was dying. Not in Berlin. In the air." By nightfall, Germany's once proud fighter squadrons were reduced to fragments, a handful of aircraft hiding in forests or abandoned barns. Even Adolf Galland, now stripped of authority and disillusioned, admitted that the Luftwaffe had been destroyed not by numbers alone, but by the loss of spirit. The sound of nothing when the bombing ended, the silence was worse than the explosions. No sirens. No engines. Only the slow crackle of fire consuming the remnants of steel and ambition. That night, the black smoke drifted east, carried by the wind, over rivers, ruined towns, and shattered morale. For the Allied crews flying home, it was the most haunting sight of the war. The same smoke that had once marked defeat now marked victory, though no one could bring themselves to celebrate. It was not triumph that filled the sky. It was finality. Broken wings over the Reich. In the days that followed, Allied reconnaissance teams captured what little remained of the Luftwaffe's forward airfields. Photographs taken from Spitfires and Mustangs revealed the same devastating pattern, hundreds of aircraft reduced to twisted metal, their blackened silhouettes scattered like fallen birds. At Gardelegen, smoke still poured from the hangars 3 days later. Nearby, a half-melted sign read simply, Fliegerhorst, entry forbidden. The Allied pilots flying above could see the irony, no one needed to be forbidden anymore. There was nothing left to protect. The German Air Ministry in Berlin received scattered, contradictory reports. Some units claimed to still be operational, others were entirely silent. Within 72 hours, it was clear, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace was finished. The once unbreakable shield of the Reich had become little more than smoke and silence. The collapse of command inside Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, panic turned to paralysis. Telephone lines jammed with desperate requests for reinforcements that no longer existed. Fuel depots had been bombed. Replacement aircraft lay half-assembled, buried beneath rubble. General Werner Kripe, serving as Chief of Staff, described the atmosphere in one sentence: we were no longer fighting for victory, only for survival. Even Hitler, isolated in his bunker, was forced to confront the truth he had long denied. For months he had boasted of secret, wonder weapons, of jet squadrons that would turn the tide. Now his orders to fly to the last plane were met with bitter silence. There were no planes left. The Allied eyes in the sky. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Allied command watched the destruction unfold with grim satisfaction. Reconnaissance units flying over Schweinfurt, Hanover, and Kassel radioed the same message again and again: no enemy interceptors sighted. What had once been the most dangerous airspace in Europe was now clear. For the first time, Allied bombers flew over Germany in daylight without opposition. Their gunners sat idle. Their formation lights blinked peacefully across the clouds. The air war, once a brutal chess match of tactics and courage, had ended not with a decisive dogfight, but with silence. The last laugh among captured Luftwaffe pilots, a strange sentiment spread. They no longer spoke of vengeance or pride. They spoke of irony. One downed pilot told his American captors, "We used to joke when we saw your black smoke from miles away. We thought it meant weakness. Then one morning, the same smoke was ours. And we understood." His words echoed the transformation of an entire generation, men raised to believe in invincibility, now staring into the ruins of that illusion. In the rubble of Flensburg Airfield, a British correspondent described the aftermath: it was as though the air itself had been burned. The smell of oil, metal, and defeat hung everywhere. The hangars were still warm to the touch. The turning of the sky. By late March, Allied dominance of the air was absolute. B-17s, Lancasters, and B-24 Liberators crossed the skies in waves so dense that German civilians described them as flying walls. No German aircraft rose to meet them. This shift had consequences far beyond the battlefield. With no Luftwaffe to challenge them, the Allies began striking deep into Germany's industrial heartland, cutting the arteries that fed its war machine. Railroads, oil refineries, armament factories. Each strike drove the Reich closer to collapse. Each plume of smoke marked another broken link in its chain of power. What began as laughter, mockery at Allied smoke, had become the symbol of Germany's downfall. The final signal at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main testing base, engineers destroyed their prototypes before retreating. Blueprints were burned. Engines sabotaged. As the fires rose, one officer reportedly sent a final radio transmission to a nearby base: "We are sending smoke. You will see it soon." It was a message layered in irony and surrender. That smoke, once a sign of Allied loss, had become Germany's last broadcast to itself. By early April, the skies were quiet. No more engines. No more signals. Only the distant hum of Allied bombers returning home, gliding above the fading haze of destruction. And beneath that silence, beneath the black smoke curling over ruined airfields, the legend of Luftwaffe invincibility dissolved, into ashes carried east by the wind. The grounded empire. By April 1945, Germany's skies, once a realm of roaring engines and proud insignia, had turned eerily still. For the first time since the war began, Allied bombers crossed the country without fear. No sirens. No contrails of interceptors cutting upward. Only the long, grey shadows of aircraft sweeping over the ruins below. The Luftwaffe, once the spear of German power, now existed mostly on paper. Official rosters still listed hundreds of aircraft, but reconnaissance photographs told the truth: most were burnt-out shells lying scattered across cracked runways. Fuel reserves had vanished. Every gallon that remained was rationed for the retreating Wehrmacht or the Führer's bunker in Berlin. Pilots who had survived years of air combat now found themselves guarding empty airstrips, polishing wings that would never fly again. Across the nation, children who once cheered at the thunder of Messerschmitts looked up in confusion as Allied bombers passed overhead, unopposed, unhurried. The sound of the Luftwaffe had been replaced by silence, and silence had become defeat. Strategic collapse. The destruction of the Luftwaffe wasn't merely symbolic. It was strategic annihilation. Without air cover, German ground forces were exposed like never before. Every convoy, every tank, every retreating column became a target. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons patrolled the roads, hunting anything that moved. In the Ruhr Valley, the industrial core of the Reich, Allied bombers attacked without resistance. Factories producing munitions, ball bearings, and synthetic oil were systematically erased. The flames visible from 30,000 feet mirrored the same black smoke that had once marked Allied losses. Within weeks, production collapsed. Fuel output dropped to less than 5% of pre-war levels. Even Hitler's armored divisions, the pride of Blitzkrieg, stalled in place. The Luftwaffe's fall had crippled the entire German war machine. The human cost in captured German airbases, Allied soldiers walked through wreckage that seemed frozen in time. A pilot's boot beside a melted propeller. A flight manual singed but intact. Empty helmets lined along the walls of shattered barracks. At Wiesbaden, American troops found the remains of a Luftwaffe squadron that had been caught on the ground, over 60 aircraft destroyed in under 10 minutes. Many of the pilots had never even started their engines. Among the ruins, Allied intelligence officers noted something haunting: personal letters, photographs, medals, untouched. It was as if the destruction had happened too quickly for goodbyes. One report from the 8th Air Force summarized it bluntly: their mastery of the skies died not in combat, but in confusion. And for the German pilots who survived, the psychological weight was unbearable. Men who once believed themselves knights of the air were now prisoners of a reality they could not reconcile, that the same black smoke they once mocked had become their own memorial. The civilians below. For ordinary Germans, the collapse of the Luftwaffe carried a different kind of terror. With no fighters left to defend them, Allied bombers now struck cities day and night. In Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin, the sky itself seemed to fall. Civilians crowded into cellars, clutching radios that now broadcast only static. The same airwaves that had once promised victory now whispered surrender through broken signals. Each new bombing raid brought another wave of black smoke, and each one reminded the people below that the Reich had lost not just the air war, but the war itself. The unspoken truth: by late April, even the most loyal officers stopped pretending. In secret reports, Luftwaffe command admitted total defeat. There would be no recovery, no miraculous resurgence. In a final address to his men, General Galland, once the hero of German aviation, told his exhausted pilots, "Our duty is not to die in the air, but to live long enough to remember." His words marked a quiet surrender, not signed on paper, but sealed in exhaustion. The war in the skies was over. The smoke had spoken. The captured skies. When the war finally collapsed in May 1945, the Allies didn't just conquer cities, they inherited the wreckage of a once feared air force. At Lechfeld, British and American troops walked into hangars filled with strange, alien-looking machines. Swept wings. Rocket engines. Jet prototypes that had never reached mass production. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, stood silent under the fluorescent lights, its smooth metallic skin covered in dust, its promise unrealized. Technicians and engineers, some still wearing Luftwaffe uniforms, stood beside their machines in stunned silence. They knew what the Allies knew now: Germany had possessed the technology of the future, but not the time to use it. American engineers quickly dismantled the Me-262s and shipped them home for study. British officers examined the WW2 jet bomber and wrote in disbelief: they were building the future in the middle of destruction. The irony was sharp. The skies that once carried the terror of Blitzkrieg now carried only the ghosts of what might have been. Operation Lusty, the race for secrets. As the Third Reich crumbled, a silent war began, not with bullets, but with notebooks and blueprints. Allied intelligence units, under Operation Lusty, swept through Germany hunting for aircraft technology, radar systems, and scientists. They found underground factories, half-finished jet engines, and experimental weapons beyond imagination. The Americans moved first, gathering data, capturing scientists, and smuggling them west. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the rocket engineer whose V-2 Terror had bombarded London, and whose work would later send mankind to the moon. The Soviet Union did the same, taking whatever the Allies left behind. Entire Luftwaffe research divisions disappeared overnight, relocated east to serve a new master. In the ashes of the Reich, the seeds of the Cold War were already growing. The men who survived, for the Luftwaffe's surviving pilots, surrender brought no peace. Some were captured. Others simply walked away, burning their flight records and disappearing into the ruins. Interrogation files show young men, barely in their 20s, confessing they had flown dozens of missions with almost no hope of return. One officer wrote in his statement, "We kept flying not for victory, but because stopping meant admitting it was over." Many never spoke again of what they saw. Those who did described a final flight that was less about fighting and more about escaping the inevitable, flying toward a sky that no longer belonged to them. Reconstruction and reflection. In the years that followed, the world divided Germany into occupation zones. But the airfields, those once buzzing hives of power, lay abandoned, reclaimed by weeds and silence. Children played among rusted fuselages. Old women gathered wildflowers growing through the cracks of runways where Me-109s once took off for battle. The Luftwaffe was gone. But its shadow lingered, in the minds of those who fought it, and in the nightmares of those who had survived beneath its bombs. The Allies, meanwhile, transformed what they captured. Jet engines from Germany became the foundation of the next era: the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, even early British jets, all carried traces of German innovation. The world that had watched Germany burn now flew on the wings Germany had designed. The Black Smoke legacy. By the late 1940s, Allied historians began writing the story of the Luftwaffe's fall, a tale not of cowardice, but of exhaustion, overreach, and hubris. Germany had built an air force that could conquer nations, but not one that could sustain a world war. Its pilots were brave, its engineers brilliant, but its leadership blind. They had created machines that touched the edge of the future, yet were bound to a cause that could only end in fire. And in that fire, something timeless remained: the black smoke that once rose over Europe became a symbol. Not just of destruction, but of warning. Every nation that watched Germany fall understood it: power built on arrogance will always burn itself out. Epilogue: the silent skies today. If you visit the remains of those airfields, Rechlin, Lechfeld, Fassberg, you'll find little more than grass, concrete, and wind. But sometimes, under the right light, the air feels heavy. As if the echoes of engines still linger, the roar of Messerschmitts, the whine of jets that never truly left the sky. And if you listen closely, you might hear what history remembers best: not the sound of victory or defeat, but the quiet after the storm. Because in the end, it wasn't bombs or bullets that defined Germany's fall, it was silence. The skies that once burned with black smoke now whisper only one truth: power fades, but history remembers. Subscribe to WW2 Heroic Realism, where the echoes of courage, tragedy, and fate live on, one story at a time.